Hello. This week we're going to be talking about, well, the schedule says resemblance, definition, and analogy arguments, but these all fall under the heading of what I call conceptual reasoning. Conceptual reasoning is reasoning about the meaning of words. Sometimes we have to reason about the meaning of words because acceptability of a premise or the success of an argument can depend upon the meaning of certain key terms in it and how their meanings relate to one another. All claims are expressed in words, but not all claims make us want to ask, that depends upon what you need by blah, blah, blah. So first, I'm going to introduce you to conceptual reasoning generally. Then we are going to talk about categorical claims and categorical arguments, or as I sometimes call them, conceptual arguments. You will find that I sometimes say conceptual argument or conceptual claim when I mean categorical claim or categorical argument. That's because when I used to teach this course in the past, that was the terminology that I used. But the reading for this week uses different terminology. It says categorical claims rather than conceptual claims. And I happen to think that a that is a better. I hope you have read the chapter for this week. It's been posted to eClass. What I say here will not be exactly the same as in the chapter, but it is good for you to get a different perspective. In this course, we don't normally base the lectures on the text. It's more like the reading for the week is a supplement to the lecture. So I'm going to be showing you how to recognize categorical claims and categorical arguments. I'm going to be showing you how to analyze categorical arguments and how to evaluate them. And by evaluate, I mean mainly determine whether or not the argument is acceptable, determine whether or not you should be persuaded by it. I talked a bit about conceptual reasoning last week when I introduced you to the different forms of inference. It's important to be able to recognize the form of inference in an argument because it is the form of inference that tells you how to understand it, analyze it, and evaluate it. After we talk about categorical claims and categorical arguments, we're going to talk about definitional claims and definitional arguments. And if we have time, also analogical arguments or argument from analogy. Like last week, I will be making extensive use of footage from the year that I had to teach this course through Zoom. Initially, I wanted to record all new, entirely new lectures for this version of the course, but it turns out that the Zoom footage has been very helpful because this is a course about skills, and the best way to learn skills is through supervised practice. We can't do that with the pre-recorded video, but we can do the next best thing, which is for me to show you me practicing it with the class using the Zoom footage. I also think that the sort of question and answer format is much more engaging than just listening to me talk. Here are some arguments that you might run across in social discourse, in social issues. I put these arguments in enthymeme form. I hope you remember what an enthymeme is so that they can be nice and short, straightforward. Marijuana is addictive and therefore should not be legalized. Okay, I'm going to skip the second one. That's really outdated. Abortion is murder because a fetus is a person. Here. It's weird, I'm making the noise, but it's not working. There we go. So, what do these two arguments have in common, apart from the fact that they have an enthymeme structure? Okay, what they have in common is that if you were presented with the argument and you had to decide whether or not you wanted to accept it, you would probably go, well, that depends upon what you mean by addictive, or that depends on what you mean by a person. Is a fetus a person? Well, that kind of depends on what you mean by person. So we call these kind of arguments conceptual arguments because they rely upon conceptual claims, which I talked about in a previous class. And a conceptual claim is a claim about meaning. The three different types of claims. One, empirical claims, which are about facts or about the way things are in the world and are verified by observation. Value claims or moral claims, which are claims about what you should or shouldn't do for moral reasons, or what's good or bad in a moral sense, or what's important or not important. The third kind is conceptual claims, and conceptual claims are about meaning. Conceptual claims are claims where their truth or falsity depends importantly upon how the words are defined, and moreover, the way that the words are defined is not straightforward in one way or another. There may be some unclarity, there may be some dispute as to how the terms are properly defined. My point is that empirical claims are confirmed or disconfirmed by doing research. You look at the facts. Conceptual claims are confirmed or disconfirmed by considering the meaning of the words involved. And then probably also looking at facts. A lot of the conceptual claims that we're going to be looking at will also require you to consider facts before you're going to decide whether or not to accept them. But first, you need to clearly define the words before you know what kind of facts to look for. So that's why we're spending a class on this, because these claims have to be treated differently than straightforward claims about facts. A conceptual argument is an argument where you have to deal with claims in terms of meaning in order to evaluate the argument. There are two different kinds of conceptual claims. One of them is categorical claims, and the other one is definitional claims. So we're going to be talking about the differences between categorical claims and definitional claims and how to deal with them. After we've done that, we're going to talk about how to deal with conceptual arguments, which may use categorical claims or definitional claims or both, but there's also just different things that come in when you're evaluating an argument as opposed to evaluating a claim. I mean, normally when it comes to claims, I'm assuming that these claims are going to be part of an argument, that they're going to be a premise, but there's things that can go wrong with arguments that can't go wrong with premises. It's like an argument has to meet certain expectations and can fail to meet those expectations in a way that a claim can't. Ultimately, it's going to come down to whether or not the words are being used consistently. But anyway, first we'll talk about categorical claims, then about definitional claims, and then we'll go into conceptual arguments. If I make a mistake and say conceptual claim instead of categorical claim. Well, if I say conceptual claim, I probably mean categorical claim. But both what I'm going to be calling today categorical claims and definitional claims are different kinds of conceptual claims. You might say that both categorical claims and definitional claims go under the category of conceptual claims. And that itself would be a categorical claim. Let's talk about categorical claims. Here's some examples. A sports team using the name or iconography of a Native American tribe is a case of cultural appropriation. Love is the most spiritual of emotions. Cannabis is non-addictive, so you don't need to worry about getting hooked. A categorical claim is basically a claim that one concept is a kind of or a subcategory of, it fits under the category of another concept, or it doesn't. So it's a claim that like X is or is not Y. Yes, like in the slide here. This is what your classic standard model of a categorical claim looks like. X is Y, or X is a kind of Y, or X is not Y, where X and Y are what we're going to call concept words. Here's some examples: natural, biological, person, justice, socialism, etc. So they're going to be, X and Y are going to be concepts. They're not going to be, for example, descriptions. What do I mean when I say concepts? Well, most of the time when I say concept, it just means like a word. It's just a word, but by calling it a concept, that sort of highlights that it's a word where I want you to think about the word in terms of what the word means. But not all concepts are one word. Concepts are frequently compound words. Here are some examples. Free market is two words, but it's one concept. It's not like free plus market. It isn't even a market that is free. It means something much more specific than that. Free market is a concept. One concept, but it's two words. Self-esteem, there you go. There's a hyphenated word. For the purposes of our discussion, when you use a couple of words together that together make one concept, I'm going to call that a compound word. Self-esteem, social democracy, two words. Sexual assault is another two-word concept. Prime Minister of Canada is a concept, and that's like a whole bunch of words. That's even more than two words. It's so many words I can't be bothered to count them right now. Let's go back and look at the examples of categorical claims that I gave you a moment ago. A sports team using the name or iconography of a Native American tribe is a case of cultural appropriation. So here we have sports team using it. This is an example of the second thing. Okay, so what's happening right now is my cat is sitting in my lap. Here, you can see her. Wow, the background is making it freaky looking. All right, there she is. Yes, okay. And she's actually rubbing her face on my computer, which is like shifting the camera. So I'm sorry about that. So anyway, this claim is saying that the sports team, using the name or iconography of a Native American tribe, falls under the category of this other term, cultural appropriation. And here, the second one, love. Here, the two concepts are love, and over here, spiritual. I mean, emotion is also a concept, but nobody would dispute whether or not love is an emotion, but they might dispute whether or not love is a spiritual emotion, let alone the most spiritual emotion. And really, we only treat something as a conceptual claim or a categorical claim when there's going to be some dispute about the proper use of the terms. Sometimes there isn't going to be any dispute. Here are some non-controversial categorical claims. Cats are animals. Nobody would disagree with that. Trout are edible to humans. Not controversial. Bats are not rodents. Did you know that there are over 1,300 different species of bats? Did you know that a foot is 12 inches? Yes, I bet you knew that. That's because this is a non-controversial categorical claim. The definition of a foot just is 12 inches. A bachelor is a man who is not married. Again, definition, but it's not controversial. So we don't treat or analyze these as categorical claims. We treat these as straightforward claims, even though they have the form of a categorical claim. They have the X is or is not Y thing, but because there's no dispute as to whether or not X qualifies as a Y, then we just treat them as straightforward claims rather than analyzing them as categorical claims. So that's important. There has to be some dispute or confusion over the proper use or meaning of the terms. Again, any claim, whether it's true or not, is going to depend upon what the words mean. But we don't argue over what cats means. We don't argue over what the word animal means. So it's not controversial. So the meaning part is not something that we have to deal with. All claims depend upon, to some extent, upon the meaning of words, but when there's no dispute over what the words mean, then we don't call that a categorical claim or conceptual claim. Hey, look, here's another list of categorical claims. Trumpism is fascism. Fetus is a person. Cannabis is addictive. Meat is murder. The sports teams won again. Conservatism has become a religion. Let's talk about categorical claims. How do you deal with categorical claims? So I said that we treat something as a categorical claim when there's some dispute as to the meaning of the words used, the meaning of the X concept and the Y concept. Sometimes a dispute over meanings occur because words are unclear. So here are two different ways in which a word can be unclear. Word that is unclear can be ambiguous, meaning there are two or more distinct meanings, that the word has two or more distinct meanings, or the concept has two or more distinct meanings, and it isn't obvious which one of those is being applied in this context. So that's why you want to go, well, that depends on what you mean by addictive, or that depends on what you mean by cultural appropriation. A second way in which something can be unclear is vagueness. Now, vagueness is about the borders of a concept. I like to illustrate this by talking about when I went to visit Russia several years ago. So I used to be married to a Russian woman, and we went to, for our honeymoon, we went to St. Petersburg. And when I was talking about visiting Russia, somebody said to me, oh, like, are you sure you want to go visit Russia? Like, Russia is a dangerous country to visit. That was where I got this particular example here. Something that somebody, true story. So this is an example of vagueness rather than ambiguity, because how dangerous is dangerous, right? You could say, well, that depends upon what you mean by dangerous, and it does. But what you're really getting at
is not that, well, there's this kind of dangerous and this other kind of dangerous and a third kind of dangerous, and I don't know which of these three different meanings of the word dangerous you're using. No, 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 that's not the problem. The problem is how dangerous is something before the word dangerous can be applied. Like, for example, you might see something in a scholarly article, like let's say like a philosophy journal, and it might say something like, it would be dangerous to assume blah 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 blah. Well, you can say dangerous there, you know, and you're not using the word incorrectly, but you know, it's not what we would normally call dangerous. You're not going to get arrested by the dictionary police or something like that. It's not the same thing as saying sniffing glue is dangerous, right? because it can actually harm you. And there's a question of the degree of risk, how much can it harm you, what's the likelihood, etc., etc. So it turns out that whether or not we want to say that something is dangerous depends upon the context. It depends upon the kind of work that we want it to do. I like to talk about concepts in terms of doing work. Like a definition, I define a definition as a tool for telling you what does and does not qualify as an instance of a particular concept. So it's a tool. A definition is a tool for getting stuff done. Likewise, a conceptual claim can be a tool for getting stuff done, as in deciding whether or not you want to take your honeymoon in St. Petersburg. Seriously, like my ex-wife had me convinced that we were going to be robbed. Like she talked about it as if, yeah, okay, we're going to be there for a week. Yeah, yeah. By the time that week, like you should just assume that we're going to be like mugged on the street in the course of that week. And of course, that didn't happen. Lots of people live in St. Petersburg, and they live perfectly ordinary lives where they don't worry about those sorts of things. So I guess she just wanted me to be prepared. I don't know. I think it's a funny story. Yes, I agree with Ivy when Ivy says lol. So how dangerous is dangerous? It depends upon the work that you want your conceptual claim to do. If you're deciding whether or not to visit a country, then you want a certain kind of answer, and you know, you're like going to be tolerating a certain degree of danger. Because, you know, leaving your house is, like crossing the street is dangerous. You know how many people have been killed or seriously injured crossing the street? How dangerous does something have to be before you call it dangerous? We don't call crossing the street dangerous. Crossing the street in St. Petersburg was dangerous, though. It turns out that Russian drivers, or at least the people driving cars in St. Petersburg, I'm going to assume that they were Russian, consider traffic laws as like guidelines. They're not laws. They're optional. You can obey them if you want or not. I mean, traffic lights, like that, people ran traffic lights all the time. Like they consider that to be optional. You know those lines in the middle of the road that, you know, set up the lanes and whatever? Yeah, no, they get totally optional. Sometimes they would drive in a whole different lane. Sometimes they would drive like on top of that line. I saw this. So if you're going to visit St. Petersburg, I'm telling you, be careful crossing the street. How do you deal with ambiguity and vagueness in a claim? Well, you deal with ambiguity and vagueness by looking at the context. For example, the context of whether or not you're going to take a vacation in St. Petersburg. And when it comes to arguments, when it comes to premises in an argument, the context is the argument. It's the rest of the claims that are made in the argument. For example, this is an example like the one that I had in my slides, but I wanted to use a different example. Cannabis is addictive and should therefore not be made legal. Okay, now this argument takes the form of an enthymeme, and I introduced you to what an enthymeme is in, like, I think week 2 or 3. An enthymeme is simply a useful way of thinking about a simple argument. This claim has got 2 parts, right? It has, sorry, this argument has got this sentence. This sentence has got 2 parts. The first part is cannabis is addictive, and the second part is it shouldn't be made legal. Now, one of these claims is going to be the conclusion or the thesis, and one of them is going to be the premise or a reason. I'm going to give you 2 seconds to figure out which is which. Are you done? All right. Well, the sentence that starts with the word therefore is the conclusion. Now, the thing about an enthymeme is that it is an incomplete argument, which means that it has an implied premise, which we have to supply for ourselves. Anybody want to tell me what the implied premise here is? Like, what also needs to be, let's say we agreed, let's say we accepted the premise, cannabis is addictive. What also needs to be true for the conclusion, it shouldn't be made legal, to follow? Or how do you get from the premise to the conclusion? We need something to connect them. How about something that is addictive should not be made legal? See, when it comes to the enthymeme and the implied premises, what you're really looking for is an unspoken thought that connects this to, that connects the premise to the conclusion. So for instance, if we didn't have the implied premise, we would have a premise that talks about cannabis and talks about addictive, and then a conclusion is it shouldn't be made legal. But like, well, where does legal come in? Well, legal comes in the implied premise that you have to supply. Cannabis is addictive, something that is addictive should not be made legal, therefore cannabis should not be made legal. That's the complete argument. So this is the context in which we are considering the meaning of the words. The conceptual claim, sorry, the categorical claim is the first one. The first one asserts that cannabis, and if you're not familiar with the word cannabis, you should be, because cannabis is different, is another word for marijuana. It's the correct English word for that substance and that plant. People wanted to make it illegal. When they were trying to make it illegal, cannabis was widely available and widely used in the United States and had been for at least 100 years. So it would be really weird if suddenly government agencies were trying to convince you that, you know, this herb that is you can actually buy in medicine, you know, is going to make you insane. It's really interesting history there. So the conceptual claim, sorry, the categorical claim is cannabis is addictive. So it's a categorical claim because it asserts that one thing, cannabis, is a kind of or belongs under the category of this other thing, addictive. See what I mean? So cannabis goes under the category of addictive things, things that are addictive. So how do we deal with this? Specifically, how do we decide whether or not we should accept this claim?
We determine whether a categorical claim is acceptable in the following way. First, we identify the concept slash category, and then the concept or item which is claimed to fall under the category. So in this case, the category part is addictive, and the item, the concept where we're asking whether it falls under the category is cannabis. Now, I know that the word addictive doesn't strictly fit the definition of a concept that I used earlier in the lecture, because addictive is an adjective, and a concept is supposed to be a noun. This means that the concept that we're going to be working with is addiction. See how easy that was? It's possible to think of the claim cannabis as addictive as being about whether cannabis possesses a particular feature or trait that is being addictive. But even if you treat addictive or addiction as a quality rather than a category, evaluating the claim is still all about, well, what do you mean by addictive? And so we would be using the same method to answer that. I hope I don't have to explain why addictive is the category that is the concept that needs to be analyzed. I hope I don't have to explain that, because cannabis is not a difficult or thorny or ambiguous concept. It's not the one that we need to analyze. Or you could think about it this way: the acceptability of this claim depends upon the meaning of the word addictive, a word which has a complicated and contested meaning, like some of the other examples that we looked at: cultural appropriation, fascism, conservatism. So this claim depends upon the meaning of addictive and the facts about cannabis. Okay, so we have the category and the thing which is asserted to belong to that category. Step two is to write down the defining characteristics of the category. Then we ask ourselves the question, does the thing, the item, the second concept possess the defining characteristics of the category? If the answer is yes, then we accept the claim. And if the answer is no, then we do not accept the claim. Easy peasy.
So what are the defining characteristics of addiction? Anybody?
That it starts becoming a habit to your daily life.
Okay. Becomes a habit in your daily life. Good. But I think there's more. Anybody else?
Unmanageability and compulsiveness.
That's good. Manageability. You've already said unmanageability and compulsiveness.
Yeah.
Those are two different characteristics, so I'm going to write them down on two different lines.
Okay.
Your tolerance goes up and you start feeding more.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to write tolerance, and then I'm going to write a brief definition of tolerance. Over time, you need more to get the effect. Anything else?
Well, I guess you could talk about how you could suffer from withdrawal if you
Oh,
don't have.
good point. Yes. I'll just write down the word withdrawal here, and we will know what it means by the context. Yeah, no, I was going to say, like, that's enough, but you're right. I forgot about withdrawal. So these are the defining characteristics of the concept addiction. We need to decide whether or not cannabis possesses these characteristics. Now, this is the part where research might come into it. Like, it's really, if you consume cannabis, does it become unmanageable? That's an empirical question. Does it become compulsive? Do you develop a tolerance? All of these are questions that you would answer by observation, by looking at facts. So that's often going to happen. Like, I talk about how there are like conceptual claims and empirical claims, you know, as if they were different things, and they can be different things, but sometimes, like quite frequently, a question of concept, like facts, are going to be relevant to a question of concept. But we still have to do this part. We have to do this part so that we can know what facts that we need to look for. I'm going to assume that people have talked about cannabis in the media and the social discourse enough that we're comfortable answering these questions without going and doing research. So I'll just ask you, if you smoke pot, does it become habit forming? Now, a bit of a problem here is it makes you want to ask, well, what do you mean by the word habit? And yeah, sometimes when you are trying to figure out a categorical claim, a claim that makes you want to go, well, that depends on what you mean by blah, and then you give an answer, and then, but that answer also depends upon what you mean. You might have to analyze that as well, but we're not going to do that here. If you smoke pot, does it become unmanageable? Or does it become compulsive? Meaning, I guess, you can't stop even if you wanted to. Or you might say you become dependent on it. You know, like coffee. It can. I think, like, you know, I think that the consensus here is that sometimes if you smoke pot, it becomes compulsive and you can't manage without it. But some other people can smoke it and it doesn't become unmanageable. You know, it also comes down to a question of, are we talking about using it every day? You know, because it's hard to describe something as compulsive or you having a dependence, you know, if you do it once or twice a month. So what is the answer? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We need to look at the other characteristics, I guess. Tolerance. Do you develop a tolerance for cannabis? Anybody? Yes, yes, you do. You do develop a tolerance. The first time that you have it, you don't need very much to get high, but if you do it a bunch of times, then you need to do more in order to get the effect. Withdrawal. If you are a habitual pot smoker and you stop for whatever reason, do you experience withdrawal symptoms? This is a question of fact, which could be verified by doing research. The answer is mostly no. I mean, pot smoking is very common in Canada, right? I mean, I haven't read the statistics, but I wouldn't be surprised if more people smoke pot than smoke cigarettes. And when you try to quit cigarettes, it's very difficult because you get, the withdrawal symptoms. But that doesn't seem to happen when it comes to cannabis. So the answer, do you experience withdrawal, is either no, you don't, or yeah, you do, but not so much that it matters. So let's look at these characteristics. So does it exhibit withdrawal? Sort of, but not enough that it matters. Does it exhibit tolerance? Yes. Do you develop a dependence on it? Sometimes. And unmanageability. Actually, I think we need to talk a little bit more about this. So unmanageability means something like harmful, like it interferes with your life in a way that you don't want it to. I can't just write harmful because cigarettes are harmful, like very harmful, but they also tend not to interfere with your daily life. I should have just looked this up in the DSM or something. Interferes with your daily life in a harmful way. Okay? Like, there you go. People talk about gambling addictions, and they would say you have a gambling addiction if you gamble so much that you have to start borrowing money in order to feed it. That is harmful. It's not harmful in the way that cigarettes are. Does it become a habit in your daily life? Sometimes. Unmanageability. Interfere with your daily life in a harmful way. I'm going to go with no. It's not something that people normally complain of. Compulsive? Mostly no. Dependence? Sometimes. Tolerance? Yes. And withdrawal? Not really.
Uh-oh. It turns out that cannabis possesses some of the defining characteristics of the category of addictive, and it doesn't possess some of the others. What are we supposed to do? I wish I could give you a hard and fast rule, but if there were hard and fast rules in cases like this, we wouldn't need to have courses on them. One of the things that we could do is decide which of these characteristics something must possess to fit under the category of addictive and which are merely associated with addiction. Philosophers use the language of necessary and sufficient criteria. A criterion or characteristic is necessary if something doesn't fall under the category unless it possesses it. That is, in this case, something needs to have the particular characteristic in order to fall under the category of addictive. That's what necessary means. It's necessary for it to have that characteristic. But a necessary criterion isn't necessarily enough by itself to make something fit into a category. In this case, the category of things that are addictive. Maybe something needs more than one characteristic to qualify as addictive. So in this case, the necessary criterion is necessary but not sufficient because it needs more than one characteristic. Or, or to make it even more confusing, some concepts don't have necessary or sufficient criteria. Some concepts are more like a grab bag of characteristics, no one of which is either necessary or sufficient, but if something has enough of them, the technical term here is a bunch of them, then it falls under the category. So, for example, there's something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, and it defines what it calls substance use disorder in terms of 10 criteria that you can see here on the screen. Now, these criteria track fairly closely to the ones that we came up with in our discussion, but you will see down here at the bottom, it says a patient qualifies as having substance use disorder if they meet 2 or more of these criteria. So it's not like there's one feature that they have to have or 2 features that they have to have. It's like a grab bag, like I said before. I can hear some of you yelling at the screen. What? Why didn't we do this before? Why didn't we just look up the DSM criteria for addiction? Well, I have an answer for you. When dealing with complicated or ambiguous concepts, people often say, well, why don't we just look it up? Why don't we just look it up in a dictionary, they say. The reason why you can't just look up an ambiguous concept in the dictionary is because that concept is, wait for it, ambiguous. And so the dictionary may not be helpful. The dictionary may list 2 or 3 or 4 definitions. How do you know which one to use? Furthermore, a dictionary is a kind of description of how people use the word in ordinary language. It's not designed to resolve complex philosophical or social issues. The definitions in a dictionary are frequently useful enough for you to get a handle on a concept, but they are not normally robust enough to do the work that we need them to do. Here's a tip for you. Anytime someone appeals to a dictionary definition in an argument, that's a pretty good hint that you're not dealing with a good argument, and you're probably also not dealing with a serious person. And by serious person, I mean a person who should be taken seriously as having some sort of expertise or authority on the topic. Because a serious person would know that dictionaries are not useful for resolving questions like this and cannot carry the weight of premises in an argument. There are technical definitions that are used in specialized fields like science or medicine, like with DSM that we just saw. These definitions are designed not to be vague or ambiguous, but they are also designed to work within a specific context and may not be useful when it comes to a different context, such as the context of whether or not something should be made illegal. In fact, legal definitions are frequently unhelpful in deciding legal matters. This is why we have things like lawyers and judges. Lawyers know that the way terms were defined in a 200-year-old document is not necessarily going to be helpful or applicable today. Insert picture of the United States Supreme Court here. So how does this help us here? Well, when we had this discussion in my other class, we decided that two of the characteristics that we came up with to define addiction were necessary and needed to be there for something to qualify as a case of addiction. And we decided that cannabis did not have enough of the characteristics to qualify as addictive. And so we decided that the premise was unacceptable. Because the premise was unacceptable, we also decided that the argument failed. Now, I should tell you that sometimes it is possible for an argument to succeed even when one, or sometimes more than one, of its premises is not acceptable. In this case, we were dealing with an enthymeme, which we've reconstructed into standard form as an argument with two premises. And in an argument that short, we do need all or just both of the premises to be acceptable in order for the argument to be successful.